In this session, we're going to talk about a really important question. Does science disprove faith? Now, to explore this question, we're going to actually have to look at both uh, terms we're talking about, science and faith. And so we're going to do exploration about what science really is and what faith really is, and then whether or not those things are compatible, and if so, how. And this is an important question because if you talk to anyone who's walked away from Christianity or having major doubts, many of them will point to this very question. And so I think it's really important. I'm glad we're talking about it. Confirmation of this comes from just some of the quotes that are out there and the ideas floating around. For example, famous atheist named Richard Dawkins says, science has eradicated smallpox, can immunize against most previously deadly viruses, can kill most previously deadly bacteria. Theology has done nothing but talk of pestilence as the wages of sin. In other words, Richard Dawkins is saying theology, faith, useless. Science, awesome. Right? Tim Minchin says science adjusts its views based on what is observed. Faith is the denial of observation so that belief can be preserved. In other words, science is open to correction by observation, and faith is not. Faith is kind of this blind thing. And I could go on and give other examples. Bertrand Russell said, religion is something left over from the infancy of our intelligence. It will fade away as we adopt reason as science as our guidelines. And what you can tell in just these set of quotes is that many people would say, again, that science and faith are at odds with one another. And you have to choose one or the other. And if that really is the choice before you, then most of us are going to choose science. But I'm so glad you're watching this because I don't think that's the case. I think this is actually a false dichotomy, and that science is not really truly opposed to faith. But to get at that, let's talk about what science really is. Okay, this is just Google this for yourself. This is what I took from Google. What is science? Science is the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Now, that is a mouthful, and it's necessarily a mouthful. If you think about science, its domain of study is really broad, right? It includes everything from astronomy and astrophysics to microscopic actions of cells and mitochondria and DNA and how it replicates, right? It encompasses so much. It encompasses, again, the study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world. So it's limited to the physical and natural world. And the study is done through observation and experiment. Now, here's what's interesting. Most of these atheists would go on to give a secondary claim. And maybe you've heard this or even assumed it, that only what is provable by science is true. And if it's not provable or testable by science, then we know it's not true or should be at least held in suspicion. Now, here's the problem. If you think about that claim for just a minute, my question would be, what scientific test or observation did you do to determine that? Only what is provable by science is true? What experiment did you do that proves that only what is provable by science is true? This is actually not a scientific claim. It's a philosophical claim, or more technically, it's a faith claim. It's a claim about the nature of our world and how it operates that is not actually testable by science itself. Christian writer Tim Keller says, it's one thing to say that science is only equipped to test for natural causes and cannot speak to any others. Sure, like let science do what science does. But it's quite another claim to insist that science proves that no other causes could possibly exist. So what you have to see is that if you just take science on its own terms, it studies the natural world. That's what it limits its domain of study to, which is totally okay. I have nothing against that. But what science has said is we will not consider supernatural causes, supernatural events. We're not going to consider that. That's not our domain of study. That's outside of our domain of study. And again, that's perfectly appropriate to say, this is my domain of study, and I'm going to stay within that and not consider other things. That's fine. What is a problem is to say, so therefore I know those other things don't exist because I'm not going to study them. it's kind of somewhat a ridiculous analogy, but what I've heard to illustrate the weirdness about this is like, let's say there is a birthday cake sitting here, and we bring a bunch of scientists to tell us about this birthday cake. And they can tell us so many things about this birthday cake, right? They can tell us every ingredient that went into it. They could probably analyze it to tell us what temperature the oven was at when it baked it and how long it was in the oven. They can tell us and break down the calories in it, which I don't really want to know about it because I want to eat it but not feel guilty, right? But they could tell us all kinds of things about the substance of this cake, what it's made out of. They can get at the what. But what they cannot do is get at the why. Why is this cake here? Whose birthday is it? Who made it? And just as ridiculous as it would be for scientists to say, no, we know exactly what this cake is made out of, and therefore we know that there is no cause for this cake. That's kind of in some ways similar to when scientists say, we know exactly how this world works, therefore we know that there is no cause for it. Well, let me make that case more strongly and even give you some scientific evidence for it. We are living at an amazing stage in the history of science. There have been amazing discoveries. And one of the big ones that's happened within the last 100 years is confirmative proof of what's called the Big Bang Theory. And so what astrophysicists have done and others have confirmed is that if you look out at the stars and use telescopes to measure the distance between us and the light from other stars hitting us, what you realize is happening is that our universe is constantly expanding. Every single star and every single point in our universe is slowly moving apart. Now, if you think about that, that means you can actually work backwards from that. That if you go back in time, you can graph and simulate the coming together to a singular point. Everything that we have, all the matter in the known universe came into existence at a certain point in time. And before that point in time, many scientists would say that there was no matter at all, no space, and no time, right? So this is really interesting to me because what science has said is that there is a point in which the natural world came into existence. Now, what domain does science study? The natural and physical world. So what has it said by definition we're not going to study? The non-natural world, the supernatural world, things outside of the natural world. And so now science has conclusively said there is a point at which the natural world came into existence. And so my point is this. The point before that point, you cannot do science anymore. If science is going to be limited to the natural world, and the natural world came into existence at a certain point in time, then the point before that point, science cannot answer those questions. Paul Copan writes this. He says, in all cases of scientific explanation, one already has to have a universe in existence before scientific explanation, initial conditions, laws of nature, and so forth have something to which they can apply. Scientific explanations presuppose the universe in order for those explanations to be employed in the first place. Thus, and here's his conclusion, a scientific explanation cannot be used to explain the very thing. Now notice, he's not saying, I don't think a scientific explanation should be used. He's saying, by definition, it cannot. The way science is being defined right now, a scientific explanation cannot be used to explain the very thing, the universe, that must exist before a scientific explanation can get off the ground. You have to have a universe in place to do scientific study. And if you say the universe came into existence at a certain point, then before that point, you cannot do science anymore. Which means that this big, huge question of how did it all get started, science by definition cannot answer because there's no nature at that point. This is why Frank Turek says, to say that science can disprove God is like saying that a mechanic can disprove the existence of Henry Ford. It's a confusion of categories. Now, a lot of people, when I talk to them about this, they'll bring up, well, what about the multiverse? Now, this is a theory that's growing in popularity, and I'm going to be honest, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a mathematician. I have heard there are good arguments to propose the multiverse. I don't understand those arguments, to be honest. But in my mind, that doesn't actually solve the problem in any way. Here's why. One is that if you are trying to propose that the multiverse kind of answers this, like the reason we have a universe to live in is because of the multiverse. Because somehow there's millions of universes springing into existence all the time. Well, one, if the multiverse theory is true, then we cannot have evidence for it, right? We cannot access these other universes. So sure, there may be millions of them, and we cannot access them. And so really that is just as big of a faith claim, right? I believe we're all here because of this multiverse thing that I have no scientific evidence for. The bigger issue in my mind is that if the multiverse theory is true, that this just makes the problem bigger. Now you have to come up with some kind of cause for not just our universe, but millions of universes. That again, that cause must be greater than those universes in the first place. And so really, you're not answering the question, you're just pushing it back. And you're requiring that the answer be even bigger and greater than just our universe. It isn't really an answer to the question of how did we get here? How did the Big Bang happen? Which leads me to what I think is one of the most scientific reasons to believe in the existence of God. Because again, we now have conclusive scientific evidence that the universe began to exist at a certain point in time. And philosophers have long talked about this idea of the cosmological argument for the existence of God. And it's a very simple argument. It simply goes, anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. Again, it's a very simple argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. If something begins to exist, it has to have something that caused it to begin to exist. This is why people debate, right, the chicken and the egg. And this is why it's kind of this everlasting silly debate, because a chicken can cause an egg, but an egg can also cause a chicken. But what we don't have any evidence for at any point in our personal experience or in scientific inquiry into our world is something happening or beginning to exist without a cause. We don't have any eggs just appearing out of nowhere. They always come from chickens, right? Anything that begins to exist has a cause. This is just something that's true scientifically and experientially. And then again, the second premise, the universe began to exist at a certain point, and therefore it must be that the universe has a cause. And by definition, the cause must be outside of itself, right? Things don't cause themselves to begin to exist. So that cause must be greater than the universe itself. That cause must be powerful enough to be able to cause a universe to exist, which begins to sound a lot like what Christians believe about God. I'm not trying to convince you that Christianity is true simply with this. I just want you to see that there is good scientific reasons to believe that Christianity might be true. And hopefully you're beginning to see by this point that actually science and faith are not opposed to each other. They actually can go together. Now, one thing I have to discuss for a minute is Christians and their views of creation. Because a lot of people have the understanding that no, all Christians believe that the earth is 6,000 years old and so is the universe. And that's not scientific, and therefore I can't believe it. And so I want to talk for a minute about what Genesis 1 and 2, the first chapters of the Bible, teach about creation, and how there's actually a lot of disagreement among Christians about how to read this. I don't want this to become a full-fledged course on this question. We might do a resource like that at some point. But here's what you need to know. Here's the basics. Genesis 1:1 says this, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And all Christians believe this is true. That the reason there is something rather than nothing is because God caused it to be. So all Christians believe that God created, but Christians actually disagree to a big extent about how God created. Now, none of us were there. And so what we rely on is the stories preserved in the scriptures and preserved in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Now, to understand some of this debate, you have to just understand simply that a little bit about genre or type of writing. Now, that's a fancy word, but we encounter this all the time. The way you read a newspaper, if you've even seen one recently, the way you read a newspaper is vastly different than the way you read an Instagram post, isn't it? And the way you read an Instagram post, that has different rules, if you will, than the way you read, let's say, a poem or a love song. And that's most basic level. This is the issue we come across when we turn to Genesis 1 and 2. different Christians disagree about what kind of writing we're reading. We all agree that it's true. We just disagree about the original intent of that writing, what kind of writing it is, and therefore how it should be read. Is it more poetic, or is it more historical and chronological? And depending on where you land on that question, you might have a variety of views. And there are a variety of views within Christianity. Some believe in immediate creationism, that we should read Genesis 1 and 2 as more chronological and historical. And when it says day, it means 24 hours. Another view is progressive creationism, that God caused everything, but he took a long time to do it. And there's several variations of this. Again, I won't get into all the details. Some Christians believe that when he used the word day, he meant age. So over a period of long ages, God created the complexity of life we see on earth. But God did it, not evolution. And then finally, some Christians are evolutionary, believe in evolutionary creationism. So they believe that you can think of it like a clockmaker who builds a clock and then twists it up for the first time and pushes the spring in and it starts ticking and telling time. And some Christians believe that that's kind of like what God did with the universe, that he put all the pieces together, and then when he was ready, he put it into motion and he let it do what he designed it to do, which was to evolve and change over time. Here's my point. Christians within any of these camps would respond very differently to the claims of science about how old the universe is and how old the earth is and what to do with fossils and questions like that. Again, my point here is not to get into this debate. My point is simply this, that when you look at what Christians believe about this question, Christians disagree about it. And historically, this has not been a test for genuine Christian faith, your view on this question. Again, all Christians believe that God created, that is a central claim, but Christians disagree about how he chose to create, and there is freedom for disagreement there. And so what that means is that if you believe evolution is true, that should not be a barrier for considering the claims of Christianity. There are some Christians who believe evolution is true and Christianity is true. These do not have to be mutually exclusive. I know that raises maybe more questions than it answers, but it's an important question, but I don't believe it should be a barrier to faith into Jesus. That's science. Before we close, let's just talk a minute about faith. Because again, going back to those opening quotes about science versus faith, there's kind of this misunderstanding that faith is blind. But I don't think that's true. The more I've tried to study what faith actually is, the more I think that faith is not belief in spite of evidence, it's rational trust in light of the evidence. So if I have some free time, I love to go down to Castlewood Canyon and go rock climbing. And rock climbing, I think, illustrates this perfectly, because I am not like a crazy, risky person. I do a form of rock climbing called top roping, where you walk to the top, or climb very safely to the top. You set up your ropes, then you walk back down, and then you climb, and you have an anchoring system in place. And when I go rock climbing, what is happening is I'm putting faith, I'm putting trust in the equipment. I'm trusting that if I fell, the rope wouldn't snap, the rope wouldn't break, the anchoring system wouldn't come out. I'm putting faith in this system, and I'm expressing that faith by climbing. And I think the same thing is true of Christianity. When I propose Christianity to people, and again, if you're searching and looking for answers and considering Christianity, the last thing I would suggest or hope for is for you to have a blind faith or trust in spite of the evidence. No, what I would love for you to have is trust because of the evidence, rational trust in light of the evidence. There's still faith, there's still trust, but there's so much evidence. And in this session, we've looked at some of the scientific evidence, but I don't think that's the greatest evidence for Christianity. I think the greatest evidence for Christianity is the historical evidence, which is why we'll give you a resource related to the historical evidence for the person of Jesus and the reliability of the New Testament accounts of him. Because I think the study of history actually provides the greatest confirmation of Jesus. And so I encourage you, don't stop here, keep pressing forward. Albert Einstein said this. He said, "Science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind." I say, let's not be blind or lame. Let's pursue both together.